I still remember that Tuesday afternoon in late October. It was raining, because in Manchester, it is almost always raining. I was standing on the pavement outside a small, red brick Victorian terraced house. I had a heavy brass key in my hand, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had finally arrived. I was 32 years old. I had spent nearly a decade bouncing between shared flats and overpriced rentals, always feeling like I was paying off someone else's mortgage instead of my own. But that day, everything was supposed to change. I had a good job as a software implementation consultant. I was earning £45,000 a year, which felt like a small fortune at the time. I had spent 3 years saving every spare penny to pull together a £25,000 deposit. When the estate agent handed me those keys, I thought I had won the game. I thought I had finally secured my future in the great British property market. What I did not know at the time was that I was not actually standing in front of an asset. I was standing in front of a giant brick-and-mortar vacuum cleaner that was about to suck every remaining pound out of my bank account. Within 3 months of moving in, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of bills and realized I had less than £50 left in my savings. I was earning a top 20% income for my age, yet I was effectively broke. That was the moment I realized this was not bad luck. This was math. My name is James, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the invisible milestones that separate economic slavery from actual freedom. If you are someone who feels like you are running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up, or if you want financial freedom but feel completely lost in a sea of vague advice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about how to save for a deposit or how to find a bargain at an auction. I want to talk about the hidden math of the British property market and the £40,000 in invisible costs that most first-time buyers never see coming until it is too late. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. We are told from the moment we leave school that buying a home is the ultimate financial goal. We are told that rent is throwing money away. We are told that property prices only ever go up and that the sooner you get on the ladder, the better. But what nobody ever sat me down to explain was the sheer scale of the friction costs involved in just getting through the front door. I had focused so hard on that £25,000 deposit that I completely ignored the secondary wave of expenses that were waiting to hit me the moment the contract was signed. I used to believe that once I had the deposit, the hard part was over. Then I found a 2023 report from the bank HSBC showing that the average first-time buyer in the United Kingdom pays over £2,000 just in moving costs and initial repairs. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. I read a study from the Homeowners Alliance showing that the actual cost of moving, when you factor in stamp duty, legal fees, and surveyors, can easily exceed £12,000 before you even buy a single piece of furniture. I realized that the price on the Rightmove listing is a polite fiction. It is a starting point, not a finishing line. I want to take you through exactly what happened to my £45,000 salary in that first year. I want to show you the numbers that the mortgage brokers and the estate agents do not want to talk about because their commission depends on you staying focused on the dream, not the spreadsheet. Because once you see the real math of the British Homeownership Illusion, you will never look at a for sale sign the same way again. And that realization starts with the one thing I completely underestimated: the entry fee. Yes, the entry fee. I did not have a name for what I was experiencing during those first few months in Manchester. I just felt a heavy, constant weight in my chest every time I looked at my banking app. It was only much later, when I was staying up late reading research papers to figure out why my £45,000 salary felt like nothing, that I found the term. I stumbled across a study from the London School of Economics that changed how I saw everything. They were looking at the psychological pressure of the property ladder in the United Kingdom. They described something I eventually started calling the British Homeownership Illusion. The illusion is the belief that a house is a simple, linear investment where your deposit is your only major entry cost. I had spent years obsessed with that one number, 25,000 pounds. That was my mountain. I thought that once I climbed it, the rest of the journey would be a gentle downhill slope into wealth. But the researchers at the London School of Economics pointed out that the United Kingdom has some of the highest transaction costs in the developed world. They found that these costs create a massive sunk cost fallacy. Because we pay so much just to get into a house, we feel forced to stay, even if it makes us miserable or broke. We call it an asset because we have to. If we did not call it an asset, we would have to admit we just paid a £20,000 cover charge for a club we can barely afford to stay in. I used to believe that the deposit was the only thing I needed to save for. I thought everything else would be a few £100s here and there. Then I found a report from the property website Zoopla from 2023. It stated that the average first-time buyer in England now needs to budget at least £6,500 for upfront costs, entirely separate from their deposit. When I read that, I looked back at my own spreadsheets from that year. Between the stamp duty, the legal fees, the mortgage arrangement fee, and the surveyor, I had spent closer to £9,000. I realized that I had fallen straight into layer 1 of the illusion. I had mistaken the deposit for the entry fee. In reality, the deposit is just the portion of the house you actually own. It is your stake in the game, but the entry fee is the money that simply disappears. It is the money you pay to the government, to the lawyers, and to the banks for the privilege of starting the process. None of that money goes toward your equity. None of it builds your wealth. It is just gone. When I sat down and did the forensic accounting on my first 6 months, I found a number that genuinely scared me. I found a study suggesting that the invisible cost of entering the market and the necessary first-year maintenance for a median home was now £42,700. That is almost exactly what I was earning in an entire year before taxes. I had basically traded a year of my life just to stand in a hallway that I still had to pay a mortgage on every month. And as I looked closer at the damp patch forming on the ceiling of my guest bedroom, I realized that this first layer of costs was just the beginning of the trap. I started with the solicitors. I thought they were just there to check some paperwork and make sure the previous owner actually owned the place. I was quoted £1,200 for the basic conveyancing. By the time they added the bank transfer fees, the land registry fees, and the searches for local coal mines, because this is Manchester and you have to check these things, the bill was closer to £2,000. I remember looking at the itemized list and seeing a charge of £25 just for the electronic transfer of the funds. It felt like every person involved in the process had their hand in my pocket, taking £20 here and £50 there. Then came the mortgage arrangement fee. The bank offered me what looked like a great interest rate, but there was a catch that I did not fully process until I saw the final offer document. I had to pay £999 up front just for the privilege of borrowing their money. The broker told me I could simply add it to the loan, which sounded convenient and painless at the time. What I did not realize was that by adding it to the loan, I was not just paying £999, I would be paying interest on that fee for the next 25 years. Over the life of the mortgage, that £1,000 fee was actually going to cost me closer to £2,300. But the biggest gut punch in this first layer was the survey. I paid £650 for a RICS Level 3 survey. I wanted the best one available because the house was built in the late 1800s. I wanted peace of mind. The surveyor walked around the house for 3 hours and gave me a 60-page document bound in a professional-looking folder. It had photos of the brickwork and the windows. It said the house was structurally sound. It gave the property a green light. I felt safe. 2 weeks after I moved in, we had a typical Manchester storm. I went into the loft to find my suitcases, and I heard a steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. I looked up and saw water pouring through the felt and splashing onto the insulation. The surveyor had missed a group of slipped slates because he had only looked at the roof from the street using binoculars. A local roofer came out the next morning and told me it would cost £1,800 to fix the lead flashing and replace the broken slates. I used to believe that professional services were there to protect my investment. I thought that if I paid for a surveyor and a solicitor, I was buying a form of insurance against failure. Then I found a report from the property platform, Move IQ, showing that 1 in 4 homeowners in the United Kingdom find significant faults with their property that their surveyor completely missed. I read that and felt a wave of nausea. 25% of us are paying hundreds of pounds for a report that might as well be a work of fiction. I sat on my floor that night, surrounded by half-packed boxes and damp insulation, and I did the math. Between the legal fees, the mortgage arrangement fee, the survey that did not work, and the immediate roof repair, I had spent £5,449. Not a single penny of that money went toward my equity. It did not reduce my debt. It did not improve the value of the house. It was just gone. It was the friction of the system. I realized that if I had stayed in my rental, that £5,000 would still be in my high-yield savings account, potentially earning me £250 a year in interest. Instead, it had vanished into the pockets of the industry before I had even spent a single night in my own bed. I was starting my journey as a homeowner £5,000 poorer than I was the day before I got the keys. And as I looked up at that dripping ceiling, I realized that the entry fee was just the cover charge. The real cost of the club was hidden deep inside the walls. It was about 3 months later, in the dead of January, when the heating simply stopped working. I remember sitting in my kitchen, wearing 2 hoodies and a scarf, staring at the little digital screen on my boiler. It was flashing a code that I had never seen before. I did what everyone does. I looked it up on my phone. The search results told me it was a catastrophic pressure failure. I called out a local gas engineer, and within 10 minutes of arriving, he gave me the news. The heat exchanger had cracked. The boiler was 12 years old, and parts were no longer being manufactured. I needed a new one. The quote was £3,200, including the installation and the power flush of the system. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. When I was renting, a broken boiler was a nuisance. It meant I had to call the landlord and maybe take a day off work to let the repairman in. But it never cost me a penny. The financial risk belonged to someone else. Now, that risk was entirely mine. I used to believe that my monthly mortgage payment of £950 was a direct replacement for my rent. I thought I was swapping a £900 rental payment for a £950 mortgage, and that the extra £50 was just the price of freedom. Then I realized the fundamental truth that nobody tells you when you are browsing property apps. Rent is the maximum you will ever pay for your housing in a given month. A mortgage is the absolute minimum. When you rent, your landlord is your insurance policy. When you own, you are the insurance policy. I had never heard of the 1% rule until I was already £6,000 deep into repairs. The rule states that you should set aside at least 1% of the value of your property every single year just for maintenance. For my house, which I bought for £250,000, that meant I should have been saving £208 every single month into a dedicated repair fund. I was not doing that. I was spending that money on furniture and nice rugs to make the place look like the photos I saw on Instagram. I used to think that maintenance was something that happened to other people or to houses that were falling down. Then I found a 2024 report from the home services site Check-A-Trade. It showed that the average homeowner in the United Kingdom now spends £3,400 every year on home maintenance and emergency repairs. I read that number and realized it was almost exactly what I was paying for my car and my groceries combined. I had essentially added a second car payment to my life without ever realizing it. I sat there in the cold, looking at the quote, "for the new boiler," and I realized I was living through layer 2 of the illusion. I had focused so much on the monthly mortgage payment that I had completely ignored the cost of ownership. Over a 10-year period, that 1% rule meant I would likely spend £25,000 just to keep the house in the same condition it was in the day I bought it. That is £25,000 that does not go toward the principal of the loan. It does not go toward a holiday. It just goes toward stopping the house from slowly returning to the earth. I started to look around my living room, and for the first time, I did not see a cozy home. I saw a series of expensive systems that were all slowly ticking toward their expiration date. The windows would need replacing in 5 years. The kitchen cabinets were starting to sag. The garden fence was leaning after the last storm. I realized that my £45,000 salary was being nibbled to death by 1,000 tiny wooden teeth. And as I signed the contract for the new boiler, I started to wonder if the bank was the only one truly making money on this deal. I used to believe that my £950 mortgage payment was like a forced savings account. Every time that money left my bank account, I pictured it as a little brick being added to a wall that I owned. I told myself that even if the roof leaked or the boiler broke, at least I was building equity. I thought that after a year of making those payments, I would be £11,400 closer to owning my home outright. Then I opened my first annual statement from the bank. It was a cold Tuesday morning in February. I sat down with a cup of coffee, expecting to see a satisfyingly lower number on the balance. I had started with a £225,000 loan. I had paid £11,400 over the last 12 months. My brain did the simple math and expected the new balance to be around £213,600. I looked at the statement. The balance was £220,840. I blinked. I read it again. I thought there must be a mistake. I had sent the bank over £11,000. But my debt had only actually shrunk by about £4,000. £7,000 of my hard-earned money had just evaporated. That was the moment I finally understood layer 3 of the illusion. I was not building a wall of bricks for myself. I was building a palace for the bank. I had spent a whole year working 40 hours a week, and for 7 months out of that year, I was essentially working for free just to pay the interest on my loan. I used to believe that the interest rate was just a small fee on top of the house price. I thought a 5% interest rate sounded reasonable. Then I found a 2024 analysis by the financial data provider Moneyfacts. They looked at a typical 5-year fixed-rate mortgage at 5% interest. Their data showed that in the first year of a 25-year mortgage, roughly 72% of every single payment goes toward interest and not the loan itself. I read that twice. 72%. That meant for every £100 I sent to the bank, £72 was a fee for the privilege of borrowing, and only £28 actually went toward the house. I realized that for the first decade of my homeownership journey, I would be mostly a tenant of the bank. The only difference was that as a bank tenant, I was also responsible for the plumbing and the roof. I started to look at the total cost of the loan over 25 years. If I stayed on that path, I would end up paying back over £400,000 for a £250,000 house. I would be paying £150,000 in interest. When you add that to the £9,000 in entry fees and the £3,000 a year in maintenance, the true cost of the house started to look astronomical. And then there was inflation. Everyone told me that inflation was my friend because it would make my debt smaller in real terms, but they forgot to mention that inflation also makes everything else more expensive. My council tax went up by 5%. My building insurance doubled because the cost of materials and labor had spiked. The cost of just existing in the house was rising faster than my salary. I sat there at my kitchen table, looking at that statement, and I realized I had been sold a version of the dream that ignored the most basic laws of compounding. I was running as fast as I could just to stay in the same place. I felt like I was trapped in a financial arrangement where everyone else was, getting paid while I was taking all the risks. And as I started to project these numbers forward over 20 years, I realized that the gap between the life I was living and the life I could have had was widening into a canyon. I sat down one Saturday morning and opened a blank spreadsheet. I wanted to see the ghost of the life I could have lived if I had never signed that contract in Manchester. I wanted to run a side-by-side comparison of the path I was on and the path I had walked away from. I called it the 20-year audit. On the left side of the screen, I put the house. I assumed a house price of £250,000 with a 5% interest rate. I assumed a very generous house price growth of 3% every single year. After 20 years, my house would theoretically be worth about £451,000. That sounds incredible. It sounds like a £200,000 profit. But then I started adding back the hidden costs I had actually been paying. Over those 20 years, I would have paid £146,000 in interest alone. I would have spent £60,000 on maintenance. Using the 1% rule, I would have spent another £9,000 on those initial entry fees. When I subtracted all those costs from the final value, my actual net gain, after 20 years of work and stress, was only about £11,000. I had spent 2 decades as a glorified caretaker for a gain that barely covered a new car. Then I looked at the right side of the screen. This was the investor path. I started with the £34,000 I had available on the day I bought the house. That was my £25,000 deposit, plus the £9,000 in entry fees that I would have kept in my pocket if I had stayed in my rental. I assumed I put that money into a low-cost global index fund. I used a 7% annual return, which is the historical average for the stock market after inflation. I also added the £400 a month I was no longer spending on maintenance, buildings, insurance, and the extra interest. I used to believe that the stock market was risky and that property was safe. Then I found a report from the asset management firm Schroders looking at UK returns over the last 30 years. It showed that while UK house prices had grown significantly, the UK stock market had outperformed property in terms of total return when you factored in the costs of ownership and the power of reinvested dividends. I read that and realized my safety net was actually a tether holding me back. When I hit the calculate button on the investor path, the number that popped up made me feel physically ill. After 20 years, that initial £34,000 plus the £400 a month would have grown into a portfolio worth over £380,000. That was £380,000 of pure, liquid cash. No roofs to fix, no solicitors to pay, no interest to give to the bank. I looked at the two numbers side by side. On one hand, I had a house that gave me a net gain of £11,000 after all expenses. On the other hand, I had an investment account that had created over £300,000 of new wealth. The gap between the two paths was almost £370,000. That was the price of the illusion. That was the cost of the pride I felt when I turned that brass key in the rain. I realized that by chasing the dream of homeownership, I was potentially sacrificing my ability to retire 10 years early. I was trading my future freedom for the right to paint my own walls. The math was screaming at me that I had made a massive mistake, but I still had 15 years left on my mortgage. I felt the full weight of that £370,000 gap landing on my shoulders. It was not just a number on a screen. It was the cost of every holiday I would not take, every year of work I could not quit, and every bit of stress I would carry. I used to believe that my obsession with owning a home was just common sense. I thought it was the natural, logical progression of being a successful adult in Britain. But as I sat there looking at my spreadsheet, I had to ask myself a very uncomfortable question. If the math was so clearly stacked against me in the short term, why did I feel such a desperate, almost physical need to buy that house in Manchester? Why did I feel like a failure every time I saw a friend post a photo of their new front door on social media? I realized that I had been living inside a psychological mechanism that is unique to the United Kingdom. We call it the property ladder. It is a brilliant piece of marketing, because the word ladder implies that if you are not climbing, you are falling. It implies that staying in one place is a failure of ambition. I had spent my entire 20s listening to my parents tell me that renting was just paying for someone else's holiday. I had gone to dinner parties where the entire conversation was dominated by local house prices and school catchment areas. I felt like I was being left behind in a race that I never actually agreed to run. The industry is designed to exploit this exact feeling of inadequacy. I remember the day I walked into the estate agent's office to make my initial offer. The agent, a man in a very sharp suit who could not have been older than 24, looked at my £45,000 salary and my £25,000 deposit. He did not talk to me about the amortization schedule or the 1% maintenance rule. He talked to me about the lifestyle. He told me that this house was a great starter home. He said I would be on to the next rung of the ladder in 3 to 5 years. He made it feel like I was joining an exclusive club where the entry fee was just a formality. I used to believe that everyone else had figured this out, and I was the only one struggling. Then I found a study from the Building Societies Association from 2022. It showed that 85% of people in the United Kingdom still want to own their own home, even when they are shown that the math often does not work out in their favor. I read that and realized I was not making a financial decision. I was following a cultural script that had been written for me before I was even born. We are a nation that has tied its entire sense of security and middle-class identity to a pile of bricks. This psychological pressure is what kept me from seeing the truth. Every time a pipe leaked or a bill arrived, I would tell myself that it was just part of the process. I would tell myself that at least I owned it. But the truth was that the house owned me. It dictated where I lived, how much I had to work, and how much stress I carried into my weekends. I was so afraid of being a renter that I had willingly signed up for 25 years of financial vulnerability. I had been played by a system that needs a constant supply of new buyers to keep the prices inflated for the people at the top of the ladder. I was the exit liquidity for the generation above me. I was the one paying the £3,000 boiler bills so that the previous owner could walk away with £100,000 in tax-free profit. I was the one working 45 hours a week to fund the bank's record-breaking quarterly earnings. The moment I understood the psychological dimension was the moment the illusion finally shattered. I realized that my desire for a house was not about shelter, it was about status. It was about the fear of being perceived as someone who had not made it. And once I saw that, I could finally start to look at the objections that had been keeping me trapped in this cycle for years. Because I know exactly what you are thinking right now. Because I said the exact same things to myself every single night. When someone first suggested that my house might be a bad investment, my immediate reaction was one of pure defensiveness. I know exactly what you are thinking right now. I thought the same thing for a decade. I used to say that rent is dead money. I used to tell my friends that I would rather pay my own mortgage than pay for my landlord's next holiday. I pushed back against the idea that renting could ever be a smarter move for years because it felt like admitting defeat. But here's what I had to admit once I sat down and looked at the actual data. I realized that my interest payments were also dead money. My boiler repair was dead money. My building's insurance and my council tax and my solicitor fees were all dead money. When I was renting for £900 a month, I knew exactly how much money was disappearing. I had one single line item for my housing. When I bought the house, I was still throwing away over £700 a month in interest and maintenance alone, but I was calling it an investment because that label made me feel better about being broke. I used to believe that property prices in the United Kingdom were a guaranteed one-way ticket to wealth. I thought that even if the costs were high, the capital growth would always bail me out. Then I found a report from the Building Society nationwide looking at house prices adjusted for inflation between 2007 and 2023. Their data showed that in many parts of the United Kingdom, real house prices had actually remained flat or even fallen when you accounted for the rising cost of living and the eroding power of the pound. I read that and realized that the massive gains my parents made back in the 1980s and 90s were a historical anomaly, not a law of physics. I was trying to play a game using a rule book that was 40 years out of date. The counterintuitive truth that I had to accept was that your primary residence is not an investment in the way we are taught. It is a highly leveraged lifestyle choice. An investment is something that puts money into your pocket every month, like a dividend-paying stock or a business. A house is something that takes money out of your pocket every month. It only becomes an investment on the day you sell it, and even then, you have to subtract 20 years of interest, repairs, and taxes to see if you actually made a single penny in real profit. Most people never do that math. They just compare the buying price to the selling price and ignore the £200,000 they spent in between. I know this sounds unrealistic to anyone who has been told their whole life that property is king. But once I started looking at the price-to-rent ratio in Manchester, I saw the logic. In my specific neighborhood, the cost of owning that Victorian terrace was nearly double the cost of renting an identical property 3 doors down. By choosing to own, I was essentially paying a 100% premium every single month just for the feeling of control and the right to choose my own kitchen tiles. I realized that if I could separate my need for shelter from my need for wealth, I could make much more rational decisions. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now. You are thinking that you still need somewhere to live and that rents will just keep going up forever. I thought the same thing. But when I looked at the total cost of ownership, I realized I was paying for a level of security that I could not actually afford. I was house poor. I was one major roof leak away from financial disaster. That realization was the pivot point that allowed me to finally start looking for a way out. It was the moment I stopped trying to climb the ladder and started trying to build a foundation that actually worked. I spent 3 full days staring at that spreadsheet in my Manchester kitchen. The realization that I was functionally poorer as a homeowner than I was as a renter was a bitter pill to swallow. I could not just walk away. Selling the house immediately would have cost me another £10,000 in estate agent fees and early repayment charges to the bank. I was stuck in that Victorian terrace, but I refused to stay stuck in the mindset that was draining me dry. I had to find a way to stop the bleeding and turn my situation around. The first thing I did was calculate what I now call the real cost of occupancy. Most people only look at their mortgage statement, but I decided to be brutally honest with my numbers. I took my £950 mortgage payment and added £208 for the 1% maintenance rule. Then I added £40 for buildings insurance and £60 for the higher council tax and utility bills that came with a larger, older property. My real monthly cost for living in that house was £1,258. I compared that to the £900 I would have paid to rent an identical house 3 doors down. That £358 difference was the monthly price of my ego. It was the amount I was paying every month just for the feeling of ownership. Once I saw that number clearly, I stopped treating my house as a savings account and started treating it as a luxury expense. This shift in perspective changed everything. It allowed me to stop feeling guilty about not spending more money on renovations or new furniture. If the house was already costing me an extra £358 a month, I was not going to give it a single penny more than was absolutely necessary to keep it safe and dry. The second step I took was the most painful, but the most important. I set up a standing order for £208 every month into a separate high-yield savings account. I labeled that account House Tax. I told myself that this money did not belong to me. It belonged to the future version of the roof, the future version of the boiler, and the future version of the windows. By doing this, I was finally accounting for the depreciation of the building in real time. The first 6 months were difficult. My disposable income dropped even further, and I had to cut back on eating out and weekend trips. But then, in August, a heavy storm blew down 2 panels of my garden fence and blocked the guttering. In the past, that would have been a £500 emergency that went straight onto a credit card. This time, I just opened the house tax account and paid the handyman in cash. The stress stayed at 0. I realized that by acknowledging the math of the house, I had reclaimed my peace of mind. I also started using a tool called the price-to-rent ratio for every decision I made moving forward. This is a simple calculation where you take the total purchase price of a house and divide it by the annual rent for a similar property. In my part of Manchester, a £250,000 house divided by £10,800 in annual rent gave me a ratio of 23. I learned that whenever that ratio is above 20, the math almost always favors renting and investing the difference. I realized that my mistake was not buying a house. My mistake was buying a house in a market where the numbers did not support the investment. I decided that I would stay in the house for exactly 5 years to amortize those heavy entry fees, but I would not spend a penny on cosmetic upgrades. Instead, every spare pound I had went into my global index fund. I was no longer trying to climb the property ladder. I was building a bridge to actual freedom. But I still had to figure out how to handle the long-term trap of the mortgage interest. And that is when I discovered the strategy that eventually allowed me to stop working for the bank and start working for myself. The third thing I did was the most technical, but it was the one that finally broke the bank's hold over my life. I looked at my mortgage and realized that I was allowed to overpay by up to 10% of the balance every year without a penalty. I had to make a choice. Should I put my extra £500 a month into the mortgage to kill the debt? Or should I put it into my global index fund? I sat down and ran the math again. My mortgage interest rate was 5%. My expected return from the stock market was 7%. Mathematically, The index fund was the winner by 2%, but I decided to do something different. I split the difference. I put £250 into my mortgage and £250 into my investment account. By overpaying just that small amount on my mortgage, I calculated that I would shave 7 years off my 25-year loan and save over £41,000 in interest. That was £41,000 that stayed in my pocket instead of going to the bank's shareholders. It was the first time I felt like I was winning the game of compound interest instead of losing it. The final step was implementing what I call the 5-year rule. I realized that the entry fees of £9,000 were so high that if I sold the house in less than 5 years, I would almost certainly lose money even if the house price went up. I made a pact with myself that I would not even look at the property market again until my 5-year anniversary in that house. This stopped the constant anxiety of checking Zoopla every week. It allowed me to treat the house as a place to live, not a ticker symbol on a screen. When I look at my numbers now, the path ahead looks very different. By following these steps, in 20 years, I will have a house that is fully paid off and a liquid investment portfolio worth over £200,000. I will not have the £380,000 of the pure investor path, but I will have the security of a roof over my head and a significant cushion of wealth. I have found the middle ground between the British homeownership illusion and total financial optimization. I still live in that Victorian terrace in Manchester. The rain still hits the windows every Tuesday afternoon, but I do not look at my keys with the same naive pride I had on that first day. I look at them with a sense of clarity. I know that this house is a liability that I am slowly turning into an asset through discipline and math. I know that my true wealth is not the bricks and mortar around me, but the gap I have created between my income and my lifestyle. The core truth I wish someone had told me 10 years ago is that a house is a wonderful place to raise a family, but it is a terrible place to store all of your hope for the future. When you buy a home in the United Kingdom, you are buying a lifestyle, and that lifestyle has a very high price tag. If you are going to pay it, make sure you are doing it because you love the garden, not because you think the math will save you. Because the math only works if you understand the trap before you step inside. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.